The story of Ozzy Osbourne isn't just about music, it's about survival, chaos, and the cost of living as if death was always one step behind. His final days weren't defined by sold-out stadiums or wild antics, but by silence, frailty, and a haunting truth that shook even the fiercest fans. What really happened as the Prince of Darkness faced his last encore? Tonight, we dive into the shocking and heartbreaking truth behind Ozzy Osbourne's tragic final days, where pain, legacy, and defiance collided one last time. Part 1. The Fall That Changed Everything. In 2019, what seemed like a simple accident became the cruel opening act of Ozzy's final chapter. Inside his Buckinghamshire home, he stumbled, fell, and instantly knew something had gone wrong. The fall dislodged metal rods that had been fused into his spine years earlier after his near-fatal quad bike crash in 2003. But this time, there was no stage comeback waiting. There was only agony, endless hospital corridors, and the creeping shadow of Parkinson's disease. He would later whisper to an interviewer, "It was pain beyond anything I'd ever felt." Chilling words from a man who had once survived prison fights, drug binges, plane crashes, and even a coma. But this wasn't just another wound. It was the beginning of a slow unraveling. Doctors confirmed the worst. Parkinson's, a disease that doesn't announce itself with thunder, but instead erodes in silence. The tremors began, his balance faltered, his voice, once the weapon of heavy metal, became fragile. His body betrayed him in ways no audience could see under stage lights. For Ozzy, it wasn't simply a diagnosis, it was identity theft. The man who once leapt across stages now needed canes, handrails, and round-the-clock care. For someone who had lived his life screaming against the void, this forced quiet was more brutal than any wound. But if the disease exposed his weakness, it also revealed his defiance. He refused to vanish quietly. In 2020, he released Ordinary Man, an album haunted by grief and tremors, but laced with raw defiance. Each lyric was less performance and more protest. "I'm still here. I still have something to say." Sharon, his wife and anchor through decades of storms, remained at his side. She adapted their home, oversaw his therapy, and whispered encouragement when even breathing seemed exhausting. Their home slowly transformed into something between a sanctuary and a medical ward. Ramps replaced stairs, railings lined hallways, nurses came and went. And yet Ozzy still wandered into his garden, headphones on, listening to Sabbath riffs like echoes of the man he once was. To the world, he was fading. To Sharon, he was still fighting. Each morning, no matter how frail, he muttered the same words, "I'm not done yet." It was that stubborn defiance, the same force that once made him survive bar fights and overdoses, that kept him alive a little longer. But the truth was undeniable. The fall had shattered not just his body, but the illusion of immortality. The Prince of Darkness was now locked in a battle with time itself. Part 2. The Man Behind the Myth. To understand the tragedy of Ozzy's final days, you have to go back to the boy who never thought he'd live long enough to grow old. John Michael Osborne was born in Aston, Birmingham in 1948, into poverty so raw it shaped his soul. 6 children crammed into a home where silence was survival and tenderness was rare. Dyslexia left him struggling to read and write. Teachers branded him stupid. Classmates turned his learning disability into a weapon, fists and words breaking him down daily. When he was 14, that silence almost swallowed him. Alone in a small bedroom, he tied a rope from his mother's washing line and tried to hang himself. His father found him, cut him down, and then beat him, believing weakness deserved punishment. Ozzy later admitted, "Pain didn't get you sympathy. It got you punishment." From then on, he wore silence like armor. But even armor cracks. By 17, he was hungry, jobless, and desperate enough to rob a clothing shop. He ended up in prison, and it was there, inside Winston Green, that fate whispered instead of punished. One day, the Beatles' "She Loves You" played over a tinny prison radio. For Ozzy, it was revelation. That moment changed me. I didn't know how to play anything, but I knew I needed to be on stage. I needed to scream louder than the pain inside me. That scream became his salvation. When he joined Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, they weren't trying to be famous. They were trying to survive. They called themselves Black Sabbath, and together they carved grief into guitars, despair into distortion. Ozzy's voice wasn't trained, but it was truth. Raw, imperfect, and soaked in the wounds of his youth. That authenticity built heavy metal. And it was why, decades later, his decline struck fans so deeply. To see the man who had once terrified the establishment tremble against Parkinson's was to watch a scream fall silent. His final days weren't just about illness. They were about echoes of that broken boy who always felt invisible. The tragedy wasn't simply that Ozzy was dying. It was that he had finally run out of ways to scream against the silence. Part 3. Love and Legacy. If Ozzy Osbourne's music was his scream, Sharon was his lifeline. Their marriage was never a fairy tale. It was a war, scarred by addiction, betrayals, and moments so dark they nearly destroyed everything. The bond between them was forged not in ease, but in fire. And yet, through every collapse, every relapse, every brutal night when chaos threatened to swallow him whole, Sharon refused to let him vanish. She once stood over him in rehab, exhausted but unyielding, and whispered, "I know you're still in there." It was less a plea and more a command, a declaration that she would not surrender him to the void he seemed determined to embrace. By the final years of his life, that bond had transformed into something unbreakable. Sharon was no longer just his wife. She was his caretaker, his defender, and his gatekeeper against a world that never stopped demanding pieces of him. She adjusted their home with quiet precision, installing ramps where stairs once stood, lining hallways with railings, ensuring that every corner of the house whispered safety instead of danger. She managed his estate with the sharpness of a general, protecting not only his fortune, but the fragile remnants of his health. And above all, she shielded him from the vultures of fame, allowing Ozzy to live his final days as a man, not as a spectacle. Their children carried fragments of his legacy, each in their own way. Amy, the eldest with Sharon, chose the path of quiet rebellion. Rejecting the glare of reality television, she built her own music on her own terms, proof that silence can be just as powerful as a scream. Kelly mirrored her father's resilience, outspoken, irreverent, and fearless. Her career a testament to both defiance and survival. Jack, once dismissed as the awkward son of a rock god on reality TV, became his father's steady companion. He was often at Ozzy's side during hospital visits, quietly ensuring his father's dignity was never stripped away. Even Jessica and Louis, his children from his first marriage to Thelma, though less in the public eye, remained connected. They may not have sought the spotlight, but they were part of the constellation that encircled Ozzy in his final years, reminders that his legacy was not just forged in music, but in blood and lineage. Ozzy's decline forced his family into roles they never asked for, but accepted without hesitation. They were no longer simply his children or his spouse. They became guardians of a myth, protectors of a man whose body was failing, but whose spirit still demanded to be honored. His final years weren't measured in platinum records, sold-out arenas, or screaming headlines. They were measured in who showed up when the lights finally faded. And when the world mourned Ozzy Osbourne as the Prince of Darkness, his family remembered something more intimate. A father, a husband, a flawed man whose legacy lived not just in riffs and records, but in the love that surrounded him at the end. Part 4. The Final Performance. On July 5, 2025, Birmingham stood still. What unfolded that evening was less a concert than a collective prayer, a requiem disguised as a performance. More than 40,000 fans filled the arena, their voices hushed, their eyes fixed on the stage. Millions more watched through glowing screens across the world, waiting for the man who had once terrified the establishment, electrified youth, and screamed louder than pain itself. And then, slowly, he appeared. Ozzy Osbourne, no longer the untamed figure leaping across stages, but an older man leaning heavily on a cane, Sharon's arm steadying him with each careful step. The crowd did not roar. Instead, a reverent silence fell, thick and heavy, as though the audience collectively understood the sacredness of the moment. They were not there for spectacle. They were there to witness the closing of a life lived louder than thunder. His voice cracked as he greeted them, his hands trembling against the microphone stand. But when the first notes rang out, time itself seemed to bend. The tremors, the frailty, the years of illness and pain, they didn't vanish, but they became part of the performance. Each lyric carried the weight of survival. Each breath was defiance. At one point, Ozzy leaned forward, eyes wet under the stage lights, and whispered words that broke every heart in the building. This may well be the last time I ever stand on a stage. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't for effect. It was truth spoken aloud, heavy with finality. You could feel the gasp ripple through the arena, an ocean of grief and reverence merging into one. But Ozzy didn't just perform that night, he gave everything away. Every note, every tremor, every ounce of himself was poured into the music. And when the curtain finally threatened to close, he left a gift that went far beyond sound. Every dollar earned, nearly $190 million, was donated to causes that defined his heart. Research for Parkinson's, the disease that had stolen his strength. Birmingham's Children's Hospital, a place of healing in the city where his story began. And animal rescue shelters for the loyal creatures he had always loved. This was not a farewell tour. This was a final vow. Fans wept openly because they knew they weren't watching just another concert. They were watching a man who refused to let frailty erase his defiance. They were seeing an artist who had built a genre from pain and was now closing his career not in chaos, but in grace. The stage lights dimmed. The final notes hung in the air like ghosts. And then quietly the curtain fell, not crashing down, but floating gently, like dusk at the end of a storm. It was the last scream of a man who had spent his life screaming against silence. And in that moment, Birmingham didn't just honor a legend. It witnessed the soft descent of thunder. Part 5, The Last Days. After the stage lights dimmed and the roar of the crowd became a memory, Ozzy Osbourne withdrew into a quieter world. His Buckinghamshire home, once filled with chaos and laughter, grew smaller, more fragile, until it felt less like a mansion and more like a sanctuary. Days no longer revolved around rehearsals, tours, or interviews, but around the rhythm of survival, therapy sessions, carefully measured medications, and the endless cycle of fatigue that Parkinson's forced upon him. Yet even in decline, there were moments of grace. On good days, Ozzy would sit in the garden, grandchildren curled at his feet, telling them stories of bats, madness, and the wild days that had once defined him. Sometimes he retreated to his home studio, not to record but to remember. He would close his eyes, let old riffs play through the speakers, and allow the echoes to remind him of the man he once was. Those sounds were no longer about fame or rebellion. They were fragments of memory stitched together with both pride and sorrow. In this twilight stage of life, Ozzy chose honesty over spectacle. On his podcast with Sharon, the woman who had stood beside him through every collapse and resurrection, he spoke plainly about mortality. "It's just the next tour," he said of death, his voice softened by years of strain, but without the sound check. Fans who listened heard not fear but acceptance. For the first time, the Prince of Darkness was preparing to walk into silence, and he wasn't afraid. By early 2024, he finalized his will, not out of dread, but out of reverence for the life he had somehow survived. Beyond the expected inheritances to Sharon and his children, Ozzy set aside millions for the causes that had mattered most to him. Mental health programs tailored for musicians, addiction recovery centers for those drowning where he once nearly sank, scholarships for working-class kids who dreamed of guitars instead of escape. In a private note to be read after his death, he wrote, "Music saved me. Maybe it'll save someone else." It was a line that captured everything he was, a broken boy from Birmingham who screamed himself into legend, and in the process, gave others permission to scream too. And then, on July 22nd, 2025, Parkinson's finally silenced him. He did not go out in fire, in chaos, or in another near-fatal accident. He slipped away quietly, Sharon by his side, children gathered close, love surrounding him in the very space that had once been filled with storms. For a man who had lived screaming, biting, bleeding and clawing through the chaos of life, his death was almost gentle. The Prince of Darkness closed his eyes not to pyrotechnics or applause, but to the soft hum of family voices and the weight of a legacy that would outlast him. And in that silence, the world realized Ozzy Osbourne's greatest act was not survival nor spectacle, but the simple, defiant truth that legends never really die. Ozzy Osbourne's final days were not a slow fade, but a revelation that survival itself can be an art form. From a broken boy in Birmingham to the Prince of Darkness, his life was proof that pain can be turned into poetry and chaos into legacy. His death wasn't just the end of a career, it was the closing of a myth. Now the world is left with echoes. Every riff, every lyric, every scream carries the weight of a man who should never have survived but did, again and again, until time itself became the only force he couldn't outlast. But perhaps that's the final truth. Legends don't vanish when the lights go out. They live in the silence that follows. If Ozzy's story moved you, share a memory below. Like this video, subscribe for more stories of legends, and let the echo of his scream remind us that even the most broken souls can leave the world burning brighter than they found it.